morning and welcome to Oasis Sunday morning online service. We always want to remind and encourage everyone that watches to say hello and good morning and greet one another in the comments below this video. And while you do that, check out some announcements that we have for this week. Our food pantry is currently running on a bi-weekly basis. The next food share will be October 17th from 10:30 a.m. to 11:45 a.m. We are still asking that everyone who shows up to please wear a mask and remain socially distant from all others who are also present. If you or anyone you know needs food desperately in between food shares, please feel free to reach out to us. We often have an overabundance from each share and tend to store it at the church, and we want to be able to help our community in any way that we can when they need it. You can reach us through message on Facebook, or you can email or call our church office, and all of that info can be found here on our Facebook page or our website. For our members who financially contribute to the church, there is 2 digital options for you to be able to continue to give during this time. If you go to our website and click on the Give tab, you will see both digital options there. You can give online or give by text. Those will further explain how to do that on both pages of the website. You'll also see a third option for giving, and that is to give by mail. You can address a check to Oasis at Conway Gardens and send it to us through the mail. You can find our address on our website under the Give tab. We do want to thank every person that contributes to the church. We know this is a hard time to give, and we are grateful and appreciative of every dollar that you contribute. Contributing to the church means we are able to keep our doors open and continue serving our community. We are adding a prayer service to our Facebook page on Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. This is just a time for us to pray over the needs of our members, our community, our nation, and our world. If you have any requests you would like prayed over in the video, you can comment them in this video comments or send us a private message through Facebook. We hope you'll join us for a quick time of prayer this Thursday at 6 p.m. Don't forget to stay connected with us through social media. You can see regular updates on our Facebook page, Oasis at Conway Gardens. You can see our live videos on Sunday mornings through Facebook and through our YouTube channel. And you can see all of the past sermons in our online service playlist on all 3 of our social media accounts, our Facebook page, our website, and our YouTube channel. This week concludes our current series, Letters to the Corinthians, A Stormy Church. Let's all try to remember that the way of Jesus is radically more different, more holy, more self-sacrificing, and more loving than we realize. We hope you join us again next week as we start a new series. Thank you again for joining us this week for our message. We hope you enjoy the message and the time of music, and we hope to see you here again next week.
There's I can see now with open eyes.
Darkest water and deepest pain, I wouldn't trade it for anything, 'cause my brokenness brought me to you, and these wounds are a story you'll use.
So I'm
thankful for the scars, 'cause without them I wouldn't know your heart, and I know they'll always tell of who you are. So forever I am thankful for the scars. Now I'm standing in confidence with the strength of your faithfulness, and I'm not who I was before. No, I don't have to fear anymore. So I'm thankful for the scars, 'cause without them I wouldn't know your heart, and I know they'll always tell of who you are. So forever I am thankful for the scars. I can see how you delivered me. In your hands and your feet, I found my victory. I can see how you delivered me. In your hands and your feet, I found my victory.
I'm thankful for your scars, 'cause without them I wouldn't know your heart. And with my life I'll tell who you are.
So forever I am thankful. I'm thankful for the scars, 'cause without them I wouldn't know your heart, and I know they'll always tell of who you are. So forever I am thankful for the scars.
So forever I am thankful for the scars.
Good morning. I'm Eric Lowdermilk, interim pastor at Oasis at Conway Gardens Church here in Orlando, Florida. Welcome to our Sunday morning service this October 11th, 2020. Who died and made you boss? Dr. Richard Pratt was a professor here at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. In his commentary on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he tells the following story about wrestling over power in leadership in the local church. I was only a child, he says, when I sat terrified in the church pew. It was a congregational meeting, a business meeting as they called it, and the men of the church were shouting back and forth at one another over some controversial decision that had been made. One man stood out from the rest. Stood out from a congregation of several thousand, he says. He was older, had a long white beard. He looked just like Santa Claus, and he had always been more than kind to me. So my attention was riveted as he pointed his finger at the pastor. He stood there, shouting at the top of his voice, "Who died and made you boss?" If there's one thing that threatens the peace of every church at one time or another, it's the struggle over authority. Someone has to set the pace. Someone has to take the lead. but churches often question who will be the boss. Our scripture reading for today comes from 2 Corinthians. This is the last in our series, Letters to Corinth, a Stormy Church. I had to remember the title there. I think it's Letters to Corinthians, a Stormy Church. Our message comes from 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13. And today's passage that I'm going to read are 2 Corinthians 11, 4 through 5, and 2 Corinthians 12, the second half of verse 5, or 5b through verse 10. While you're turning there, let me urge you once again to read the passage on your own during the week. These three chapters in 2 Corinthians, 10, 11, 12, and 13, I guess that's 4 chapters, I can't count, are the backdrop for today's message. And today's message will make far more sense if you read those. And I designed my sermons so that my sermon will make reading those chapters far more understandable. Let's read. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus different from the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a spirit other than the one you received, or a different gospel than the one you accepted, you put up with it well enough. For I consider myself not at all inferior to these super apostles. Now, skipping down to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 5b through 10, Paul is starting to sum up his argument. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except about my weaknesses. For if I wished to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be telling the truth. But I refrain from this, so that no one may regard me beyond what he sees in me or what he hears in me, even because of the extraordinary character of the revelations. Therefore, so that I would not become arrogant, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to trouble me, so that I would not become arrogant. I asked the Lord 3 times about this, that it would depart from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So then, I will boast most gladly about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may reside in me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, with insults, with troubles, and persecutions, and the difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul's dealing with authority issues in the church, and our message today is going to deal with that. But more importantly, our message is going to deal with the lifestyle that is the answer to these problems. Consider another story. Wikipedia tells us that James MacDonald is a Canadian-born evangelical Christian pastor, television evangelist, and author. He was the co-founder and senior pastor of Harvest Bible Chapel megachurch in the Chicago area. He was the host for the church's former broadcast ministry, Walk in the Word. Harvest Chapel grew from 18 people meeting in a high school in 1988 to more than 13,000 people on 7 campuses in the Chicago area. In 2017, the church was included in Outreach Magazine's top 100 fastest growing churches in America. However, in 2013, 3 elders resigned their positions, citing a culture of fear and intimidation. Well, eventually allegations arose of a history of financial mismanagement and abusive leadership by the pastor. Things spiraled out of control to the point that in February of 2019, MacDonald was fired from Harvest Church by the elders. And unfortunately, there's more, much, much more, but we'll spare our sermon those details. Obviously, this church had a problem, an abuse of power problem, and many churches deal with the abuse of power or the converse, the submission to leadership. How do we navigate that? Well, Dr. Pratt, the author of our first story today, says of our passage today that a power struggle also took place in Corinth, In Paul's absence, opponents to his ministry had resisted his authority over the congregation and had asserted themselves as apostles. Paul addressed the claims of these opponents and asserted his authority. So we're going to address that today, power and leadership in the church, but more importantly, the Christ-like lifestyle that is the antidote to that problem. Let's get started. Paul's writing this section confronting the Christians in the church at Corinth because some were still not submitting to his leadership. Why? Because other so-called super apostles, yes, super apostles as Paul calls them, were coming into the church and exploiting people and the gospel in Paul's leadership. He says in chapter 12, verse 11, "For I lack nothing in comparison to those super apostles, even though I am nothing." Notice the play on words. I lack nothing, even though I am nothing. These super apostles have brought letters of recommendation. And so now the Corinthians are requiring Paul to have letters of recommendation. His response earlier in the letter is, hey, you guys are our letters of recommendation. We led you to Christ. The fact that you're Christians means you're our letter of recommendation. These super apostles were saying they had lots of visions and spiritual experiences to legitimize their claims, such that Paul says he also could boast about visions as well. They claim to have traveled a really long way, probably from Jerusalem or the Jerusalem area, just to preach to those in Corinth. They charged fees, probably big fees, for their ministry. And they were seducing and exploiting the people of Corinth, and some were just falling for it, left and right. So all of this boasting of themselves as super apostles and the putting down of Paul as an apostle has led to problems. So again, Paul's dealing with authority and leadership issues. 2 weeks ago, when we spoke on correction and discipline in the church, I suggested that rugged individualism was negatively affecting the church, such that we were afraid to practice correction in the church. Well, let's return to that today just for a moment and talk about 3 ways in which rugged individualism affects problems of church leadership. The first way is that the effect on people that makes them not want to follow or submit to even good or healthy leadership and authority. That's sort of saying, no one can tell me what to do. So first, some people, because we're so individualistic, we don't want to submit even to a good superior. The second is the effect on pastors and leaders who think they can rule exclusively, and thus they abuse people under their leadership. We know from Galatians 2 that Paul, as a leader, confronted another leader, Peter. So we see a pattern in the New Testament where no one ruled exclusively. Paul actually submitted himself to the leadership in Jerusalem to make sure the gospel that he was preaching was correct. The third effect is on people resulting from this abuse of leadership, whereby we no longer want to submit to any leadership or authority, and this is due to past hurts of abuse. So 3 reasons. Individualism alone makes us not want to submit to leadership. Abuse by leadership causes hurt and pain, and then we have the reaction to that, a reaction to pain, that on top of that, people even further don't want to submit to leadership due to abuse. So what's the biblical response to this? The biblical response is community, not rugged individualism. Acts 2:42 through 47 says everyone in the church had all things in common. All things in common. And that includes authority and submission. So let's talk a moment about mutual authority and mutual submission. My favorite passage on this is Acts 15:22, when the church has been debating how to treat Gentiles who become believers and what to require of them. When James, the apostle there, James was a disciple. Maybe some would argue he was an apostle because he had seen his half-brother Jesus. But the point is, when James put forth a solution, Luke writes for us in verse 22, then it seemed good to the apostles, to the elders, and the whole church. So you have the individual leaders, the apostles, those selected to assist in leading, the elders, and then the congregation. It seemed good to the apostles, the elders, and the whole church. And they chose men to take the letter to Antioch, and they sent Paul, Judas, and Barsabbas and Silas along. Mutual leadership. We also see this in Paul's writing in Ephesians 5, and I'm going to read an excerpt from verse 15, and then an excerpt from verse 21. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. Skipping to verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. Submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. So on the extremes, we can't have a pastor who has exclusive authority. We can't have a church that has a leadership board, whether they be elders or deacons, that has exclusive authority. We can't have a church where the congregation has exclusive authority. Can you leave a church or vote a pastor out? Sure. Can a pastor try to force his way to stay when it's clearly time to go? Sure. And sometimes those things are unfortunately appropriate. In Acts 13, we hear that Paul and Barnabas separated ways over a disagreement. And even here in this letter to Corinth, Paul talks about a future visit where he may have to step up and be even bolder. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 2, I beg of you that when I'm present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against some who suspect me of walking according to the flesh. So mutual submission, mutual authority is the answer. And here's what we should ask ourselves. What's the best for the kingdom? Not what's best for me. What's the best for this community surrounding the church that we are trying to reach? What's best for them? What's best for the next generation of this church? One day I'll be gone. One day you'll be gone. How do these decisions put us in the background and put them first? You see, the church will always have problems. And entering into mutual authority and mutual submission comes from embracing the cruciform life. Let's take a moment and look at the cruciform life next. Folks, you'll have to forgive me a little bit due to circumstances. I'm recording outside once again, and I normally record in the evening, and today I'm recording in the morning, and the sun is going in and out, and so I apologize if it distorts my image or makes it a little bit difficult to see. So let's talk about Paul's ultimate answer, the cruciform life. There's a myth among some scholars that Paul was just too hard to get along with, always pushing people around. But actually, Paul was weak and humble when face to face with people. In fact, his opponents are accusing him of being weak face to face. Chapter 10, verse 10 says, for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. In chapter 10, verse 1, listen to how Paul responds to this. I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness of Christ and the gentleness of Christ. I, who am humble with you when face to face, but bold to you when I am away. He's sort of mocking his opponents a little bit. I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness. Now, let's back up and look at those three things in verse 1. I entreat you by the meekness of Christ, by the gentleness of Christ, and then he calls himself humble when face to face, using their words. Meekness, gentleness, and humility. That sounds to me like the cruciform life. Now, last week, we gave you two words, crucifix and the adjective cruciform, and told you the difference between the two. A crucifix is a physical cross, a small cross with an image of Jesus affixed to it, crucifix. Cruciform comes from centuries in the church of making items, churches, Greek manuscripts, in the shape of the cross. But pastors and theologians over the years have used it to talk about metaphorically shaping our lives into the shape of the cross. So what are the characteristics of the cruciform life? What does it look like to embody the life Jesus lived when he died on that cross? Well, first, it's humility versus pride and boasting. Paul's use of the word humble here in verse 2 means to figuratively lower oneself in the presence of another. It comes from a word that means to lower, and it means to take a lower position when you're around someone else, like a servant takes a humble approach, like we should take in reference to Christ, but more importantly, how we should respond to one another. Secondly, gentleness and meekness versus throwing one's power around. These super apostles were throwing their power around, but Paul was trying to be as meek and as gentle as he could. Meekness, as Paul uses it here, means the quality of not being overly impressed by one's sense of self-importance. Not overly impressed by one's sense of self-importance. Gentleness, as it's used here, and I looked it up, is the quality of making allowances despite facts that might suggest a reason for a different reaction. In other words, you know someone's wrong, you know they're out of line, but you make allowances. Now, I'm not talking about abdicating authority or not stating something's wrong, but you act with grace despite the fact that maybe someone needs a heavy hand. Another aspect of the cruciform life is other-centeredness versus self-centeredness. We need to be focused on others. Surrender versus taking control. Surrender versus taking control. Now, there's three types of church leadership, and we're not going to get into them. They're all flawed because they all have humans. But all forms of it need to have some form of surrender to others. We hear no response out of Peter in Galatians 2 that he bucked Paul when Paul confronted him. Evidently, Paul felt it was correct. Peter felt that rebuke was correct. Surrender versus taking control. And then service rather than being served. Paul's answer to the leadership issue was, sure, I can boast, but I'm not a super apostle, and I'll boast not in the things they boast about. I'll boast in my weakness, in my lowliness. I've got this problem, this thorn in the flesh, and everyone tries to figure out what the thorn in the flesh is, probably to justify our own issues. But Paul's point is his validation as an apostle is that he's so weak, is that he has to depend on Christ. The fact that Christ uses him despite this weakness is a sign of the cruciform life. He submits to Jesus. Paul's answer is the cruciform life. But you know what? It wasn't just Paul's answer. It was Jesus' answer to power struggles as well. Sure, the cruciform life comes from the cross. So, of course, Jesus embraced the cruciform life. His very physical life was the shape of the cross, but as well, the way he lived his life shaped to what we're talking about. But what does that mean? Well, let me ask you three questions regarding leadership and authority. Here's the first one. Did Jesus have authority? Did Jesus have authority? Well, sure he did. Let me read you this from Matthew 26. Then Jesus said to them, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you not think that I can appeal to my Father in heaven, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels. Jesus here is responding to Peter taking out the sword and beginning to fight. Jesus could have taken authority, and he tells us that he could do that. He had authority. Here's the second question. What did Jesus say? What did he have? Did he have authority? Yes, he had it. Secondly, what did he say? Matthew 11:28 reads like this. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and my load is not hard to carry. Now a yoke is a wooden instrument carefully shaped to help two oxen or two other beasts of burden to better manage that burden. And so Jesus is saying, take that yoke upon me, especially if you're heavy burdened, if you're heavy laden. Let me read it. I'm getting confused. If you are weary and heavy burdened. Now notice that Jesus uses the words gentleness and humility here, just like Paul used. They are actually the same words. So he says, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And again, humility is figuratively lowering oneself in the presence of others. Physical subservience. Remember I told you that the cruciform life is putting others before yourself? Jesus submitted himself to a band of soldiers, guards, and a betrayer who wanted to kill him. He not only figuratively, but he physically submitted himself to them. Why? For us. He gave up his power. He could have called the angels down, but he didn't. Gentleness. Same Greek word that Paul uses, making allowances for us, despite the fact that reasons exist for a different reaction. In other words, Jesus is graceful to us even when we don't deserve it. That's gentleness. Now, I'll tell you, that's a choice. It doesn't just spring up from love in your heart. Now, it may grow over a long life of discipleship, but in the beginning, gentleness is a choice. So, did Jesus have authority? Yes. What did Jesus say? I'm gentle and humble of your heart. Take my yoke upon you. Thirdly, what did Jesus do? Paul tells us in Philippians 2 that we should take the same attitude of Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He poured out himself for others. He took the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men, he came all the way down and became like us. And being found in human form, he humbled himself further by becoming obedient. How far? To the point of death, even death on a cross. See, Jesus modeled this life that we're supposed to take on, and he tells us, especially those of us who are weary and burdened. I think I was confusing one version that says heavy laden, and the New English says burdened. Remember I said the rugged individualistic lifestyle or mentality leads to abuse, which causes us to be hurt from abuse. And Jesus says those who are weary and burdened. See, if you've been hurt by leadership, this is Jesus' answer. To take his yoke upon you of meekness and gentleness. Jesus submitted himself to the cruciform life, submitted himself to the lowest, most shameful death possible in the Greco-Roman world. Remember, Roman citizens could not be crucified. Paul was beheaded because he was a citizen. Jesus, and tradition tells us Peter, were both crucified because they weren't Roman citizens. They were considered barbarians. That's what Jesus submitted to. And Paul tells us it resulted in his exaltation. The irony here is that in Jesus' command to take my yoke upon you, is that we are submitting to Jesus' leadership. The very thing we're afraid to do, because we're afraid to submit to leadership. And why are we to submit? We're to submit to that because we have heavy burdens. We're afraid of the burden of leadership, but we should take Jesus' leadership on us to alleviate us of that burden. And you will find rest for your souls. So the answer is to take on a greater burden, a heavy yoke placed on our shoulders. Again, the irony is that when we submit to the yoke of the cruciform life, and I don't just mean followers, I mean leaders as well. Remember, we have no word of Peter not submitting to Paul's rebuke in Galatians 2. When we submit to the yoke of the cruciform life, it gives us rest for our souls. One last story here that is not as spiritual, but I think it has its application. In my time serving in the discipline office at the university, I occasionally had to give some minor consequences to students. And the university at that time, I think, only had curfew for freshmen. In the process of transitioning to adult, one should be able to manage without a curfew. But on more than one occasion, we assigned curfew to someone as a consequence for their behavior. I remember one student who, in a follow-up meeting, I probed him to ask him, so how's it been having to do curfew? He said, ironically, it's been very helpful. Being forced to come in and retire early at night has improved my sleep cycle. I'm more rested and gives me more time to study. And it's helped him. In the same way, when we mutually take on the cruciform life, when we mutually take on meekness and gentleness and putting others in front of ourselves and are willing to sacrifice for each other in the kingdom, following God's rules does bring rest to our souls and brings better church leadership in mutual submission and mutual authority. Submit to the cruciform this life and then submit to one another. Have a good week.
Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. And we lift our hearts before you as a token of our love. Holy, 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 gracious Father, gracious Father, we're so blessed to be your children, gracious Father. And we lift our hearts before you as a token of our love. Gracious Father, gracious Father. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. And we lift our hearts before you as a token of our love. Hallelujah.